This video is about hemispheric lateralization and split brain research. It is a video which is going to be most useful for people studying A-level psychology, AQA, syllabus number 7182. If you're just studying the AS level, then you don't need this material until next year, but the video is also going to be useful for anyone studying any psychology A-level and for anyone who's interested in the brain. Okay, hemispheric lateralization. Well, the first thing to realise about the human brain and about all mammal brains is that they have two hemispheres, the left and the right. The word hemisphere, we think of that in a planet. A planet has a northern hemisphere and a southern hemisphere. And in a planet, the north and the south hemispheres join to make a complete sphere. Well, the brain's not like that at all, because in the brain, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere are really completely separate from one another. And they are joined only in the middle by a bridge of nerve fibres called the corpus callosum. In the human brain, the corpus callosum is about 10 centimetres long, and it contains about 2 to 300 million axons. It's just axons. That is to say, it's just white matter. There are no synapses in the corpus callosum. So it's just nerve fibres running from one to the other. It's a bit like a bundle of fibre optics or telephone wires. 2 to 300 million of those in the human brain. So when the brain is working normally, the corpus callosum is buzzing with nerve impulses, carrying impulses from our left brain to our right brain and backwards and forwards across that gap. And the corpus callosum is pretty much the only means by which the two halves of our brain can communicate with one another. Okay, hemispheric lateralization. The idea of hemispheric lateralization is that people's left hemisphere and right hemisphere do slightly different jobs in normal functioning. And it's true, if we think back to video number 1, we learned that the left hemisphere is specialised for language. We looked at Broca's area and Wernicke's area in the left hemisphere and discovered that those centres are really, really important for language processing. Well, is there anything that the right hemisphere does which the left hemisphere can't do so well? Well, yes, there is. And this one particular thing that the right hemisphere does really well is face recognition. Looking at the features of a person's face and identifying an individual, regardless of whether they're wearing glasses or they've got a beard or not, or so on. Making sure that we can recognise individuals as individuals. Now, the first thing to realise about hemispheric lateralization is that it's not as clear-cut as that. If you just read the textbooks, you would believe that the right hemisphere absolutely does no language processing at all, and that the left hemisphere does nothing towards face recognition. Well, that's not true. And in actual fact, in all individuals, both language processing and face recognition are kind of distributed between the left and the right hemisphere. But it is a case that most of the language functioning takes place on the left, and most of the face recognition takes place on the right. But the thing to hold on to is that in a normal person, the hemispheres work together in a really functional way. Now, if you believe the stuff that you read in cheap science magazines written by journalists who don't know what they're talking about, if you believe those things, then you'll believe that there's such a thing as a left-brained person and a right-brained person. And in these popular psychology things, you'll read that, you know, left-brained people are really scientific and logical, and they tend to be bankers and accountants and scientists and so on, and that right-brained people, you know, are sort of artistic, inductive thinking people who are really scatty and disorganised but come out with great art. Rubbish. Utter rubbish. And in actual fact, in all people, the best functioning is characterised by the two hemispheres working together. And of course, the part of the brain that we need for that is the corpus callosum, the bit that keeps the two halves in sync with one another. It is true that we all have something called a dominant hemisphere. And if you're right-handed like me, then that means that your dominant hemisphere is your left hemisphere, and if you're left-handed, that means that your dominant hemisphere is your right hemisphere. And that is because, remember, the hemispheres of the brain are connected contralaterally to the largest extent. That is to say that the left hemisphere controls the right-hand side of the body and receives afferent nervous input from the right-hand sensory organs, and vice versa. The right hemisphere of the body controls the left side of the brain and receives sensation from the left-hand side of the body. It is also true that left-handed people are generally less handed than right-handed people. So left-handed people are often a little bit ambidextrous, whereas right-handed people are less frequently ambidextrous. Okay, so how do we know what are the functions of the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere in human beings? Well, what we do is we study split brain patients. In the 1950s and the 1960s, one treatment for epilepsy was to have what's called a commissurotomy. And that is a brain operation where the surgeon simply snips through the corpus callosum and severs it, either wholly or in part, separating the left hemisphere from the right hemisphere. And the reason they did that is that because in some people with epilepsy, the epileptic seizure would spread from the left-hand side of the brain to the right-hand side of the brain, or vice versa. And obviously cutting the corpus callosum will stop that from happening. They tried it in animals first, and it doesn't have very much effect on animals' behaviour. And then they tried it on human beings, and it turns out to be a pretty good cure for epilepsy, and strangely enough, not to have that much effect on human behaviour, which of course makes you wonder what the corpus callosum is there for in the first place. Well, it turns out to have some very unusual perceptual effects on human beings. And the person who studied that in depth, first of all, was an American neuroscientist called Roger Sperry. And he did many decades of experiments on split brain patients, and that led to him winning the Nobel Prize for Physiology in 1981. And he was later joined by Michael Gazzaniga. What they did is they took people with a severed corpus callosum and gave them various tests which could work out what the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere of the brain specialised in. In order to understand these tests, first of all, we need to just know a little bit of revision about how the visual pathway works in human beings. Now, we know that the majority of the nervous system is connected contralaterally. That means the left-hand side of the brain connects to the right-hand side of the body and vice versa. In the visual pathway, it's slightly more complicated because in both eyes there are contralateral and ipsilateral connections, connections which cross over to the other side of the brain and connections which stay on the same side. But these are organised in a very logical way. Imagine a line going down the centre of my visual field, right down the centre of where I'm looking. Everything on the left-hand side, my left, your right if you're looking opposite, everything on the left-hand side of that central line is called my left visual field, and opposite, obviously, is the right visual field. Now, obviously, both of my retinas have a left visual field and a right visual field. And the left visual field of both retinas connects to the right hemisphere of my brain. And the right visual field of both hemispheres connects to, the right visual field of both eyes, I should say, connects to the left hemisphere of my brain. So each the retina, is divided in two vertically, and one half of that retina projects to one half of the brain and the other half projects to the other half of the brain. And that means that the visual fields are organised in a really logical way. If I hold up this glue stick here and it's on the left hand side of my visual field, I'm seeing that glue stick with the right half of my brain, and vice versa if it's in my right visual field. Down at the very, very centre of my visual field, there's a very, very thin line which is actually seen by both sides of my brain. So there's no gap in the middle. And Sperry and Gazzaniga used this fact to explore what the left and the right brains of split brain patients were able to do. Okay, so how did Sperry and Gazzaniga explore the specialist functions of the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere of the brain? Well, they used a technique called the divided field technique. In a person who has a split brain, who has had the operation to sever their corpus callosum, the reason they're able to get along kind of okay in the world is because the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere can still work together. What the person does, if they're looking at an object, is look slightly to the left and slightly to the right of it, so that both hemispheres can get a good look at what's out there in the world. What Sperry and Gazzaniga did is to use a piece of equipment called a tachistoscope. And what this does is to present visual stimuli, pictures or words, to people, but in a very short sort of photographic flash of much less than 1 second in duration. And this means that if you present an image flash like that to someone, they don't have a chance to move their head. So if you present something in the left visual field tachistoscopically, then you can be sure that only the right hemisphere of the brain is going to see that, and vice versa. So what Sperry and Gazzaniga did is to present written words tachistoscopically, either to the left or the right hemisphere, or both, and to see what people can do. And what they found very quickly is that if you present a word, a written word, in a person's right visual field, remember, so the left hemisphere can see it, they will be able to read that word and they can tell you what it says and read it and respond to it normally. If, on the other hand, you present a written word to the left visual field so that only the right hemisphere can see that word, not only will they not only be able to read it, but also they won't even know that the word's being presented in the first place. And the reason for this is because, remember, the language areas, Broca's area and Wernicke's area, are in the left hemisphere of the brain. So if the left hemisphere of the brain sees something, it can read the word and it can talk about it. If the right hemisphere of the brain sees something, it can't speak. The right hemisphere is dumb, it's silent, and it may very well be seeing the word, but it can't tell you that it's seen the word. So if you present a word in the left visual field, the person won't be able to read it. So Sperry realised that he had to find a different way of communicating with the right hemisphere other than language. And he came up with a really clever and simple way of doing that. What he did is he presented a written word, for example, the word glass, to the left visual field of a split brain patient, and then showed them a choice of objects, just pictures of objects. So one of the objects would be a glass, but there might be a cup and an apple and an animal or something like that, a choice of different things, one of which would be the correct answer. And he'd first of all say to the person, what did you see? And of course the person would say, sorry, didn't see anything. That's the left hemisphere talking. But remember, the right hemisphere does know which is the object they've seen. And he'd say, will you please point to the picture of the object, which is the one that you saw. At which point the split brain patient would be able to point to the correct object with their left hand, which is of course connected to the right hemisphere and controlled by the right hemisphere. This is at the same time they'd be pointing to it with their left hand saying, I'm sorry, but in actual fact I didn't see anything and I don't know what's the correct answer. But the right hemisphere knows, and the right hemisphere is able to control the left hand independently of the vocal ability of the left hemisphere. So, we can see that the right hemisphere can actually do quite a lot on its own, despite the fact that it can't speak. Now, this begs the question, of course, how come the right hemisphere can read? Because remember, what Sperry did is he presented written words to the right hemisphere. And by using these stimuli, Sperry was able to determine that in actual fact, the right hemisphere does have some limited reading ability. And in actual fact, the right hemisphere is kind of okay at reading individual words, providing that they are concrete nouns, that they're the names of actual things that exist in the physical world. And beyond that, the right hemisphere is not very good at reading words. Okay, in a moment, we're going to be looking at some more research into split brain patients, but first it's time for this week's random psychology fact.
Here's a random psychology fact for you. Did you know that Milgram and Zimbardo, who were both interested in social influence, actually went to the same high school?
That was this week's random psychology fact. Right, Sperry's experiments. Another interesting experiment that Sperry did is to present people with compound words. For example, the word cowboy. And what he would do is present people with the word cowboy tachistoscopically, and they would have to look at a star in the middle, and the word cow would be written on one side of the star and boy on the other side of the star. And he'd present this to people tachistoscopically and then ask them what they saw. Now, of course, the first thing that they say is to say what was presented in their right visual field. So, looking at the word cowboy in the right visual field, the left hemisphere, the verbal hemisphere, is going to read what it sees there, and when they were presented with this compound stimulus, people would say, yeah, I saw that and I read the word boy. He then asked them to point with their left hand to what they saw, and he'd offer them a choice of 3 or more things. A picture of a cowboy, to start with, a picture of a cow, a picture of a boy, and perhaps 1 or 2 other things in there as well. Now, if you or I saw that compound stimulus, obviously with a functioning corpus callosum, we'd just point straight with both hands to the cowboy. However, split brain patients don't do that, and what they do is that with their left hand, they point to what the right hemisphere saw, which is cow, and with their right hand, they point to what the left hemisphere saw, which is a boy. And they'll point to 2 different things at the same time. And typically they'll say, no, I saw a boy, and they'll say what the right hand is pointing to, because that's the left hemisphere, the verbal hemisphere, controlling the right hand. And they'll say, I don't know why my left hand there is pointing to a cow. But the left hand will continue to point to a cow. And sometimes, with split brain patients, occasionally, that one hand will start trying to pull the other one to point to what it thinks is the correct answer. This is called alien hand syndrome. Of course, The ironic thing is that neither hemisphere is actually right, because the correct answer is cowboy. And in order to get the correct answer, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere have to work together in order to read that. And to do that, you need a functioning corpus callosum. Alien hand syndrome is a very unusual state of being. And people with a split brain, people with commissurotomy, sometimes say how they'll be putting on a shirt in the morning, for example, and one hand will start buttoning the shirt and the other hand will start unbuttoning it. Or when they're choosing clothes out of their wardrobe, different hands will choose different clothes that they want to put on that day, and the two hands will almost have a little bit of a tug of war about what they want to do. So this video has been about lateralization. What has this video been about?
Are you going to come and do a bit of meditation at lunch?
Oh, right, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okie dokie. Right, I'll finish this off now then. How long have we got? I've got 10 minutes. I can finish my video in that time and clear out the way then.
So hard.
Anna, can I just have like a minute? Right, I just need to.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, and then I can clear everything out. Right. So you can stay here.
Oh no, it's alright, it's cool, I've got it.
So, this video has been about hemispheric lateralization and about split brain patients.